Welcome everyone. Today's speaker is Dr. Emma Whettingsteel, who is joining us from Perth. So good morning to Emma and good afternoon to everyone else. And Tristan, good morning, you're from Perth. I first met Emma when she presented a paper at the second annual Design Research Conference, which was held at Monash University in Melbourne in October of 2019. Emma was around halfway through her PhD from memory, which she was undertaking at Curtin University in Western Australia. Her PhD investigated the role for interior design in increasing Aboriginal students' sense of belonging while living away from home at boarding school. What I found most interesting about Emma's presentation was the methodology that she used to collect data from Indigenous students, and I really look forward to hearing some more about that. Fast forward to today, and Emma has completed her PhD and is now Dr. Whettingsteel. And she is a lecturer in interior architecture at Curtin University in Perth. She has been involved in a number of cross-disciplinary research projects and draws on experience working with young people in rural community arts and student accommodation settings. The title of Emma's presentation is Yarning About Boarding School, and she's going to draw on design ideas from Aboriginal students in WA. After the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask Emma questions about her work. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and hi, everybody. So I will just share my file, which I've realised I haven't done before. Sorry. Apologies, I haven't actually used Zoom very much. Here we go. Can you guys see my PDF screen there? Yep, cool. Okay, so hello from Perth, and thank you for having me present today. So first, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on here. So that's Whadjuk Noongar people. And also where I'm from, which is a Nanda language group on Yamatji country, which is up near Geraldton, so about 5 hours north of Perth. And again, to acknowledge all of the elders and the communities that have sort of been involved in this project at various points and who are to some extent represented in the presentation as well. So firstly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of belonging. And what that means in this project. So there are lots of different ways to think about sense of belonging and lots of different ways to measure it. For this project, I was really interested in obviously the way that belonging and the built environment go together. So I was using this model from Haggerty, which is an older one, but I think it brings together really nicely that idea that your connectedness in an environment isn't just about the amount of connections that you have or whether you feel physically comfortable. You have to bring all of these things together, and that you can be comfortable but disconnected from your environment, or you can be involved but uncomfortable. And so, yeah, just wanted to start with this diagram that shows that connectedness and that real sense of belonging means that you need to be involved and have that well-being as well at the same time in an environment. So taking that forward into the context of this project, make my screen full screen. So the background to all of this is that there is this real problem in a lot of Australia really, but especially in Western Australia, where there just aren't secondary schools available in a lot of remote places. And if there are secondary school options, they usually only go up to say year 10, or they don't have a full range of subjects, or they're just quite limited. And if you are from a really remote community, there's often just no secondary school option at all. And so the current sort of policy approach to this at a government level is that it's just not financially feasible to provide those schools. And as a result of that, there's this really big increase in funding and I guess conversation around boarding schools as an option instead. And so this isn't like a new idea. This is something that's been building for a while, but especially in the last few years, there's been this really big increase in scholarships, new usually city-based boarding facilities, and lots of looking at different models of how to do this. And the thinking behind it for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, especially from remote communities, is that they will be able to learn, get these really good opportunities and be able to work towards a really good future, and still be able to return home and have this kind of back and forth two worlds approach to their education. So that's the thinking behind it. But there has been a lot of issues that have been identified in a few studies over the last few years. So 10 years ago, there was like no research into this at all. Now there's nearly 40. The first significant project was David Mander in 2012, and there's been lots of other projects that have built off that. And these studies, so working with specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' experience of boarding schools, do show that there can be these really great opportunities, and it can be a really positive experience that's really valued by the students and their families and their communities in some cases. But there's also a lot of really big issues that can come up, and big barriers to retention. So dropout rates are a big problem for the students that do go on this pathway. So some of those barriers are that shock of transition and how different the environment is, the kind of tension between your expectations and responsibilities at school and then completely different expectations and responsibilities at home, the physical separation from country, homesickness, some things that would be maybe the same for any young person that is transitioning away from home for the first time to boarding school, but then also some experiences that are really specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people who are coming from more of a remote community. So basically what's emerging from all of this research is the idea that it's not enough just to provide that funding so that the students can attend a school that's away from home, even when these are in some cases quite prestigious schools that they're being able to attend and have these really fantastic opportunities. The environment and the supports that are in place also need to be appropriate and tailored to those students as well, and that we can't just expect these young people to come from a really, really different context into a new one and then be able to automatically adjust. But so far in all of this and in all of those kind of challenges that come up, the built environment hadn't really been looked at as something that could play a role. So all of those studies are more from education, policy, psychology type disciplines. So what I was really interested to look at was how interior design and I guess the built environment more generally as well could help to increase that sense of belonging for Aboriginal young people living in Western Australian boarding schools. And so there's a few then aims within that I was looking at, which is what is that idea of belonging to begin with, and is that actually useful for evaluating that experience? What are those different parts of the interior design that will affect the young people's experience of belonging? And then what can we do with all of that to put together hopefully a fairly like a practical strategy or some actions that can actually be done to do something at the end. So an overall summary of the research is I was under the guidance of a majority Aboriginal advisory group. And so these were all people that I approached that were some form of expert or had a lot of experience or lived experience in boarding schools or had heavily researched this topic already.
Emma?
Yes.
We're seeing just the one slide. Have you got,
oh,
are
really?
you going through? Yeah, that first slide.
Oh no, yeah, I am going through, yes. Okay, what have I got up?
So maybe you've shared the wrong screen, or you shared a screen rather than
I don't think I have another screen open though. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right, I'll try that again.
Okay.
Oh no, that's a shame. I'll quickly show you them to catch it up.
It makes you feel better. That happened to me at an international conference.
Oh, no.
And nobody told me for like 8 minutes.
Oh dear. Okay, I'll try that. It looks like it's the same one for me.
Oh, yeah.
You guys can see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I don't know what happened there. I won't obviously talk through it again, but I'll just show you the slides because some of them were important. So that's the first one that you saw, the acknowledgement slide. This is the diagram about the sense of belonging that I was talking about. So I don't know if you saw that, but so obviously very interested in this connectedness space, so where the involvement and confidence, sense of well-being come together. This is all of the kind of articles and press that has been happening around boarding schools over the last few years. So there has been really a lot of it. These are the outcomes, sorry, the barriers from the literature review. So when young people are coming into those boarding school environments, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, these are some of those challenges that they have been shown to have based on the research so far. Questions and objectives, which I talked through anyway, and here is the research summary. So that's where I was up to. Okay, I'm going to try and make that full screen and see if it stays okay. Is that all good? Same page? Yeah, cool, okay. Okay, so yeah, under the guidance of an Aboriginal advisory group, the project used a participatory action research methodology, and the data was collected around a large roll of brown paper with a semi-structured yarning format. And there were 52 participants. 27 of those were current students, 18 were past students who had graduated in the last 10 years, and there were 7 experienced boarding school staff members. So there was also a mix between private independent schools in Perth metropolitan area, and then some that were outer metropolitan, and then one school that was rural and that catered mostly to Aboriginal students that had come from remote communities. So that one was important. That was really different to the boarding schools that were more your mainstream private boarding schools in the city, where it was usually a scholarship program that was bringing in a group of Aboriginal young people as part of a sort of specific program that were then a kind of minority within the larger mainstream school group, whereas this other rural school, it was all Aboriginal students from remote places. So there were a bunch of really important considerations for the methodology. One of the biggest ones, or the biggest one, is that I'm not an Aboriginal person working with not just Aboriginal people, but young Aboriginal people. So students that were away from their families and their communities, and potentially could be seen in a vulnerable situation where I'm the one coming in to do research with my clipboard, and there's a power dynamic there to be really careful of. So the methodology had to kind of deal with that. And the other important part of it was that the confidence of the students that I wanted to speak to might not be very high in drawing and talking about design. So it was really important that the methods be able to meaningfully capture their ideas and get to a point where they could speak genuinely about their experiences and propose some genuine ideas, but quite quickly. So boarding school schedules are really, really busy, and it's really hard to get time with students. So it had to be a method that was really quick and that could get the students to be quite comfortable and confident speaking about these things within less than an hour. And with participatory action research, one of the main things about that methodology is the whole point that it is participant-led, and that it's not just one person kind of holding on to all of that information and being the expert who is in charge of everything and oversees all of it, and nobody else really gets much of a say. So I needed a method that would kind of connect all the participants between the different boarding schools, because they weren't actually going to meet each other and be able to have that kind of transparent communication all together. So what I ended up doing was, after a little bit of trial and error, was using this really big roll of brown paper to basically go around to every single yarn, so every interview, and all of the data was collected around this roll of brown paper. So it was also audio recorded, but the benefit of this was that everybody could see everything that had happened before. And it meant that on one level, I was endorsed to some extent because the students and the people that I was interviewing were then knew that somebody else had already spoken to me and knew that I was like, okay. And they could see those ideas that had already happened and start to think like, oh, I've had that as well, or I agree with that, or then they could kind of add something to what had already been said, instead of having to start absolutely from scratch every single time. And by the time it got going and we were a few meters into the role, it was getting really messy and really loose, and it had stains and little scraps of food on it at some points. Like, it was getting kind of gross, which I was embarrassed about at first, but then it ended up being really, really good because it kind of gave the students permission to be able to be messy and not worry about their drawing skills so much, which was a big problem at the beginning. So it gave it that looseness and the kind of space for the students to be able to express themselves. So this is how that role looked at one of the boarding schools. And you can see in the bottom right there some of those like oil stains from people just putting their food on it. There's the nail polish there. So like the benefit of the role as well is that we could just put it out. And at this boarding school, I was there for a few days. So we just left the whole roll out over that few days and people could come and go. And the other activities would kind of happen around that roll of paper as well. And then again, it takes away that formality and that kind of, I'm the expert researcher, you're the student participant dynamic, because they could just come and use the role however they liked or work around it however they liked. So within that PAR, the participant action research methodology, it was also really important that the students have some control over the analysis, which is where the brown paper role came in as well, because I couldn't be, I didn't have that chance to be doing a formal analysis process with the students after each session or at the end. So it was really important that the students actually be able to reflect throughout the process. So the brown paper role meant that they could look at everything together and then tell me what they thought were the most important things based on what we spoke about at the end of each session. But then in that cumulative way, they could look at the whole thing and say, this is the most important thing that I think is coming out of this whole project as well. So it had that, gave it that transparency and meant that it was more of an iterative process instead of me kind of just grabbing data from different places and then I have to make sense of it alone, which would have been a problem. So these are the themes that came out of the project. Broadly, there are 4 big themes, which is place identity, social atlas, spatial voice, and third space. And I won't go into all of these, but the place identity is about those connections with the site and those overall impressions of what do I associate with this place? Is it a good place for me to be? Does it feel like somewhere that's really institutional or more like a home? So that bigger picture stuff. Social atlas was about these different social relationships that could be either created or inhibited by the design of the spaces. So one example of that is that a lot of students found that they wanted to be with their with the other Aboriginal students. They would make a mob together to be able to support each other, but then they would find that there was no space where they could kind of gather together in a way that they didn't feel really self-conscious. So there could potentially be spatial ways of supporting that a little better. Spatial voice was about the level of control and kind of impact that the students felt that they had within their spaces. So whether or not they could move their room around or decorate their rooms, whether or not they could plant something or do something that was more interactive and that they felt like they were there and it mattered that they were there because they could see the kind of the trace of them having done something. And then third space was about both having a culturally safe space, so a third space as in not the school, not home and culture. So somewhere in between that cultural safety or cultural more authority of home and the really mainstream culture of the school. So the culturally safe space, but also somewhere that wasn't part of the rules of school and that also couldn't replace their home. So this in-between space that was separate to school, but they knew also wasn't trying to replace that cultural role that home has as well. And then all of this I've organised into a feedback model for belonging. And the idea of this is that you've got the parts of the built environment that we know are important in creating a sense of belonging on that top left, and then the themes from the research, so the different ways that the students relate to the built environment and the different ways that they experience a sense of belonging on that top right, so their level of fit. And then down the bottom, the different actions that they could take or different experiences that they could have with the environment that could increase their sense of belonging. And so these didn't have to be positive necessarily. It doesn't all have to be like, and then I planted a garden and that felt really good. Some of those actions that they were describing could be seen as negative. So potentially like scratching your name into the back of a desk, or there were really interesting stories around leavers who'd graffitied something, and then the students who'd known those past students felt really proud and like really liked that story, and they didn't want that part of the environment to go. And then the idea of this is that the environment isn't going to be this just one static thing that is provided and will just be appropriate, that it's really important that the students have that ongoing role to be able to change their surroundings as well. So especially in boarding schools, the turnover of the students is really fast, and the students will change room every term. There's going to be a completely different cohort of students at least every year. And so that's always changing. So it was really important that the students weren't just arriving at an environment that was kind of static and fixed, but that they could have that role and see how the environment was changing over time as well. And then these are 10 actions that I've put into a booklet to hopefully be able to actually impact some designs of boarding schools. And the idea of this isn't that these are like 10 things that if you do them, the boarding school is going to be perfect and ensure that it's going to be culturally appropriate. But these were 10 quite simple ideas that came up through the yarning that I think are relatively easy to at least think about in most boarding school settings. Some of them could be quite easy, like adding a fire or putting up an Aboriginal flag, letting the students decorate their rooms a little bit more. And then some of them are more complex. But so yeah, the idea of these is that they're actionable sort of strategies that could be put into place in boarding schools. And this is the booklet. And this is just this final page that I thought was really sweet, that when I asked that question at the end about to the students about what they thought was the most important thing, these are some of the responses that came through. And I really like at the end, there's one of the suggestions is for an indoor pool with a heater and a spa, which I thought was great. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Are there any questions?
I've got a question, I guess. Hi, Emma. Thanks for that. That was really awesome. That was a really great presentation. I really like the graphics as well. I guess, first of all, I think it's really interesting that last bit there with the kind of what you can do in the design sense. I had a conversation recently about this particular thing with a friend of mine from Broome, and he spoke about particularly the fire pit stuff, and said everyone talks about wanting the fire pit, but then when it's there, it actually becomes this really expensive boondoggle that no one can use because no one knows how, health and safety and all that kind of stuff. And kind of part of the challenge is and I think you're addressing it, which is really great, is the spatial design literacy, not just with Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders, but with the general public as well. Having that spatial literacy to have those discussions and actually understand the implications of those kinds of things. But something that I was curious about is, with your research about the boarding school in particular, do you foresee a change in the kind of the landscape due to increases in remote learning and online learning, or do you see new and different challenges and new strategies that need to come into play to do the same things that you're talking about in the physical space, but in the online space as well? Do you see any way that happens?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, as far as I can tell at the moment, I don't think online learning has really replaced that need for boarding, because I don't think that, at least for the students that I was speaking to, and I think for like the students who boarding school is like that really critical difference between being able to attend high school or not, I don't think the resources for online learning are set up in a way that could offer that same experience, or yes. So yeah, no, I don't think it will. But I think it would be interesting to think about maybe the ways that students might not have to leave or go so far away from their home communities, like potentially being able to have boarding centres or like some kind of accommodation or something supplementary that's in the Kimberley, say, or like in Broome or somewhere that doesn't require having to go all the way to Perth or all the way to Melbourne, or like such a drastic change maybe. But yeah, I don't think that the online learning would replace the need for boarding.
So maybe more hybridized types of spaces potentially.
Yeah.
I think, boarding, and I may be completely wrong, it can be quite an exclusive type of thing, right? And you mentioned it in one of the comments or the quotes was about, this not the only solution. Scholarships and all that kind of stuff aren't the only solution to inclusivity and and more equitable access to this kind of stuff. So I think it's interesting thinking about what these hybrid environments might be like. And there was another comment as well, particularly about someone, we like to lump everyone into one group, particularly as designers often because it's easier. But you're talking about people who are in the Kimberley who deal with 99% humidity, 40-degree days, boarding with people from the southwest who deal with really cold winters, and expecting people just to be getting along and having the same motivations and the same backgrounds.
It was really interesting about that idea as well, and that the student that said that, she was so she was really angry about it. Like, she wasn't happy at all with, like, she just thought the boarding school staff were like stupid for doing that. And what I thought was interesting is that there's all this research around the idea of how you perceive coldness and warmness and social inclusion or exclusion. So like the people when they're cold, the other way around, when people remember that a time that they felt rejected or excluded, they estimate that the room temperature is lower than what it actually is, and the reverse as well. So if somebody's feeling freezing for a long amount of time, that could actually be having like a real physical effect on their sense of belonging as well, potentially.
That's really interesting.
I've got a couple of questions. One is architectural and one is about your method. So the architectural one, flexible sleeping options just seemed really, seemed really interesting to me. Like how would they occur?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit more about why that is needed. For some students, they're completely happy to be in a room by themselves and that's their preference. For some students, coming to a high density building for the first time, like literally it potentially being the first time they've been on a second story of a building, And then being in a room alone with the door shut in the dark was really, really scary and was a serious source of distress for them. And so in those situations, potentially it's not even a built environment thing. It could be more of the way that the service is provided issue, but being able to accommodate that even temporary flexibility to be able to be maybe with a friend or have all the new students that have just arrived be able to be in more of a communal space so that they're not alone.
No, I guess the logic makes sense. My question was more going to be, did you get to a point where you could see how that could actually be provided given the constraints of that environment?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different ways, and I don't have a really specific, this is the way that it should be. But so one example is that the rural school, they had independent living quarters as sort of a supplementary option to the main boarding house. And so for the students that it worked really well for them to be in a communal environment, they were in the dorm. For other students that found that to be overstimulating, or they were having kind of issues, fights potentially, it worked better for them to be in kind of separate independent living, and that was in an environment where they felt like they had their own space and nobody was kind of, they didn't have to manage all of those different interactions all the time, so they could focus a lot better and had a smoother experience. So I think having that kind of those supplementary options to maybe like a main environment could work really well. And I think even just having not bunk beds and not like a dorm, but being able to have those shared rooms as an option for some students, I think would be really useful. I don't think it needs to be more complex than that.
I guess the reason I was asking is it's kind of like this, so in palliative care research, people either wanting or needing socialization, but also needing private space. And some of the researchers are saying, we'll just ask patients what they feel like and then shuffle the rooms around, right? But anyone who works in a hospital knows you can't just shuffle patients around at the drop of a hat. So you really need like an architectural strategy that you can offer to people to go with it. That's fascinating though. I guess my second question was, your method's really interesting, because I've got a lot of friends who do research with Aboriginal people, and even just the process of being able to be introduced to those people takes months and months and months. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you got over those obstacles.
Yeah, it did take months and months and months. So the brown paper roll was probably a year into the project that developed, and I'd already done pilot study testing with a few people with just individual pieces of paper, and that didn't really work. It was it really was that fear of drawing, and I think putting a piece of white paper in front of somebody and saying, could you draw your ideal space, was intimidating. So there was trial and error trying to work through like those different, I guess, the logistics of like how that method could work. In terms of, I guess, more that engagement and the speaking to people and finding the right people to speak to, similar, it took a really long time. I had a few already like sort of close friends or contacts that I started with, and then I spent probably 6 months or so just emailing people, calling people, going to events that I could at boarding schools and trying to meet people, speaking to other people that had already done research within Curtin. It just was a slow process. So it built up, and then in the end, I think I was really lucky to have that support and have a few people to like really kind of like make those introductions and put me in a room with the students. I couldn't have done it without going through that kind of longer process first of finding those right people to be talking to.
Thank you. Your method is just great. It's one of the coolest things I've seen in ages.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question related to methodology as well. Well, my question goes into how do you see the replicability of your methodology? Because I know at the end you propose a specific design guidelines, sort of, right? So how do you see other settings, like those guidelines will work for other settings, or is it your methodology really the value out of your project?
Hopefully both. I think those guidelines, I want to keep saying, like, it's not like a checklist of things to do, even though it's sort of presented in that way. Like, that just absolutely won't work for every single boarding school. And there will be, you know, like, different situations that it needs to be adapted to. Hopefully, like, I really do want that to be a starting point, though, for at least, like, for just talking about the design. And like Tristan said, that spatial literacy thing of, like, just even getting even staff within boarding schools to kind of understand a little bit more about the way that the spaces are designed does matter. But the methodology, I think the brown paper roll 100% could be applied to, or could be used again in other situations. I would love to keep extending it. Like, it's at 20 meters at the moment. I think it would be amazing to be able to keep adding to that role, and maybe be able to get that input from, like, families and communities, because that's not something that's really in the project at the moment, and I add those perspectives. So I think the benefit of that methodology is that it doesn't really have to just stop at that point and be, like, really kind of rounded out and neat, even though PhD stopped at that point, that could continue, and you could, I mean, do that again with other projects with a new roll of brown paper as well.
Thank you.
Emma, I was just wondering, to do this type of research with this kind of group, how did you go getting ethics approval? Was that difficult?
Yes, it was difficult, but so I guess similar to what I was saying about that just build-up process of being able to speak to lots of different people was super, super necessary. So I had an advisory group that came out of that, I guess, networking. And one of the ladies on that advisory group is a friend that I used to live at student housing with, so that really helped a lot. And I also had, through the work that I've done in my hometown, so in Northampton, there was a senior Aboriginal lady who knows me really well, who could at least, I could get that kind of, like, a little bit of credibility through her to be able to have some of those initial conversations. So I think those personal connections to begin with were important. But so yeah, I had an advisory group. I had to change the ethics application a couple of times to adapt both to what they were asking, but also just the practicalities of speaking with, yeah, like, under 18s who were away from home was really tricky. I couldn't access Department of Education sites at all. That was, like, the ethics requirements for that would have been like just a whole other level of things that you have to do. So some of the, I guess, adjustments that I made to the project to fit the ethics approval was that we agreed the students had to be over the age of 16, which meant that they could qualify as mature minors. And as long as I had then the permission of the school and the students' permission, I didn't, and that the parents, and that the efforts had been made to inform the parents, I didn't need the parents' signature to sign off. Without that, I don't think I would have been able to have any current students be involved. That was one of the ways that I was able to get at least that older kind of cohort. And yeah, I think the advisory group was really the important part there, that I was speaking to people and changing the project based on what the advice that I was getting. Yeah, I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but it's complicated. I did have to change it a lot. It was probably a year of working on the ethics application compared to, like, what might usually just be sort of 2 or 3 months. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, we might finish up there. Thank you very much, Emma. I just heard that you're teaching 5 units this semester, so you're going to be pretty busy. Yeah. And we look forward to hearing from you again. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I think there might be a couple of new people today. I hope to see you next month.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks, Emma.
Bye.
Thanks, Emma. I appreciate it. Bye.